A U.S. Marine wrapped a jacket around a German Shepherd puppy found on the frozen trail. Hello everyone, before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Now, let's return to our main character. The wind moves first, slipping across the Wyoming ridge like a cold whisper, carrying the bite of frozen pine and the faint metallic scent of snow waiting to fall. Staff Sergeant Daniel Mercer slows his steps on the narrow trail, boots crunching over thin sheets of ice that crack softly beneath his weight. Dawn hasn't fully broken. The world lies in that pale blue pause between night and morning when everything feels suspended, breathless, listening. Dan lifts his gaze toward the tree line, steam rising from his breath in short, controlled bursts. He's walked this frozen trail every winter since he returned home, a quiet mile of solitude that steadies him in ways he never says out loud. But today, something interrupts that rhythm, a small shape curled tight near a fallen branch, barely a shadow against the frost. He stops. The silence deepens. A soft sound threads through the cold, so faint it could be mistaken for the wind. Except this sound trembles. Dan's heartbeat shifts, a subtle tightening in his chest as he steps closer, each movement slow, deliberate, as if approaching a fragile truth hidden in the snow. The shape resolves into fur, sable and tan beneath a crust of ice. A German Shepherd puppy, no bigger than his forearm, curled in on himself, shivering in uneven breaths that break the quiet like fragile glass. Dan lowers to one knee, the cold seeping instantly through his uniform pants. For a moment, he just watches the tiny rise and fall of the pup's ribs, the way frost clings to the whiskers, the way the little body fights to stay in this world. "Hey, buddy," he whispers, voice low, steady, warmed by something deeper than the cold can reach. The puppy doesn't lift his head, but one ear twitches, small, stubborn, alive. Dan exhales softly, removes his military jacket, and wraps it around the trembling form. The warmth of fabric meets the brittle chill of fur, and the pup releases a breath so faint it barely stirs the air. Dan gathers the small bundle against his chest, feeling the fragile weight, the flicker of hope pulsing weakly beneath the layers. The world around them stays silent, snow beginning to drift in slow, wandering flakes as if the sky itself tries not to disturb the moment. "You're safe," he murmurs, rising with care. The trail stretches ahead, long and cold, but Dan walks it differently now, carrying not just a puppy, but a promise born in frost and fragile breath, a promise he never expected to make this morning on a frozen trail that suddenly doesn't feel quite so empty. Snow continues to drift in slow spirals as Dan steadies his pace on the frozen trail, the small bundle in his arms warming by inches rather than degrees. Frost presses his nose weakly into the fabric of the jacket, drawing in the faint scent of wool and pine and something steadier, something that feels like safety. Dan adjusts his grip, careful not to jostle the fragile life he carries. The trail curves toward a clearing where the morning light finally breaks through the clouds in soft gold, brushing over the pup's fur and revealing how thin he truly is. Dan feels a quiet pull in his chest, the same pull he once felt on distant training grounds when a young recruit struggled to keep up. A pull that says, without words, do not walk away. The air is colder at the ridge, sharper, but Dan's steps are firm. His breath rises in pale ribbons, mingling with the soft warmth rising through the jacket. He whispers, almost to himself, "Just a little more, buddy." The puppy shifts, a small movement that brushes against Dan's heartbeat. There is no cry, no protest, just the gentle weight of trust resting where frost had been moments earlier. By the time he reaches the old wooden bridge that crosses a narrow creek, the sun has climbed high enough to soften the shadows. The creek below murmurs beneath a thin crust of ice, a quiet reminder that even in winter, something still moves, still tries. Dan pauses, listening to that sound, letting it settle his thoughts. This trail once belonged only to him, a place where he could walk off long nights and long memories, but now it feels different. Shared. Needed. Frost stirs again, a small tremble that makes Dan tighten the jacket around him. He glances down, and for the first time he sees the faintest spark in the puppy's half-open eyes, a tiny reflection of morning light. Not strength yet, but the beginning of it. The cabin roof comes into view beyond the tree-line, smoke drifting from the chimney in a thin gray line that dissolves into the brightening sky. Dan feels his shoulders loosen at the sight. Warmth. Water. A chance. He crosses the last stretch of snow with renewed purpose, boots leaving deep prints in the powder. As he reaches the porch, he keeps one hand steady under the pup while unlocking the door with the other. The hinges creak softly, welcoming them into a room filled with the scent of cedar and old coffee. Heat hums low from the stove in the corner. Dan steps inside and closes the door against the cold, holding Frost a little closer as the warmth settles around them. The pup breathes in, slow but certain, as if recognizing a place where the world might finally stop hurting. Dan kneels by the stove, easing the jacket open just enough to let a whisper of heat touch the tiny form. Frost lets out a small sound, not quite a whimper, more like the beginning of a sigh. A sound that tells Dan the morning's journey mattered, that hope is not loud but steady, and sometimes it fits in the palm of a hand wrapped in an old military jacket. Warmth settles slowly into the small cabin, moving across the worn wooden floorboards and rising in soft waves from the old cast-iron stove. Dan stays kneeling beside it, one hand steadying the jacket as he lets a gentle breath of heat reach the fragile puppy inside. Frost shifts, a tiny stretch that brushes against Dan's palm, the kind of movement that feels like a quiet answer to a question he had not spoken aloud. The room is still except for the faint hum of the stove and the soft ash settling in the firebox. Outside, the wind taps against the window like an old neighbor checking in, but the worst of the cold stays beyond the walls. Dan unwraps the jacket just enough to see Frost's face. The little muzzle is no longer coated in frost, and the whiskers tremble with each uneven inhale. The eyes, those soft amber sparks, open a little wider as the puppy tries to lift his head. It is not strength, not yet, but it is a beginning. "Easy, little guy," Dan murmurs, sliding one hand under Frost's chest for support. The puppy leans into the touch instinctively, as if he has known that hand longer than a single morning. Dan stands and crosses the room, boots whispering against the old rug, and retrieves a shallow metal bowl. He fills it with warm water from the kettle, testing the temperature with the inside of his wrist until it is just right. When he sets the bowl near the stove, Frost noses the air, curious but unsure. Dan lowers him gently beside it, one hand behind the tiny body to keep him steady. Frost sniffs the steam, hesitates, then flicks his tongue once against the water's surface. A second sip follows, weak but deliberate. Dan feels his breath release, a slow uncoiling he did not realize he had been holding since the moment he found the pup on the trail. "There you go," he whispers. "That is it." With each small drink, Frost's breathing evens just a little more. The puppy settles again, curling close to Dan's knee as if drawn to the steady rhythm of his presence. Dan rests his hand lightly on the pup's back, feeling the faint rise and fall beneath the soft fur. The warmth of the stove glows gently against Frost's tiny form, painting the edges of his coat in amber light. Dan's gaze drifts toward the window. Snow has begun to fall again, gentler this time, flakes drifting sideways in the pale morning like feathers shaken loose from the sky. The world outside remains cold and quiet, but in this small circle of heat, something fragile has taken root. Not certainty, not yet. But possibility. Frost lets out a small, content sound, barely audible, almost like gratitude carried in a breath. Dan smiles, a rare, quiet curve that softens the lines of his face. In the hush of the winter morning, with the storm kept at bay and a tiny life resting beside him, he realizes the cabin does not feel as empty as it did yesterday. Hope has a way of arriving without knocking, carried in small paws and steady breaths. The warmth inside the cabin gathers slowly, as if the walls themselves are learning how to breathe again. Dan stays close to the stove, watching Frost sleep in a small bundle of jacket and soft light. The snow outside thickens, each flake drifting past the window like a silent reminder of the cold that almost claimed the tiny life resting at his feet. Frost shifts, paws twitching in a slow dream, and Dan gently runs a steady hand along the pup's back. The fur is no longer ice-stiffened but warming under his touch, rising and falling with breaths that grow a little deeper each minute. Dan lets that quiet rhythm settle into him, smoothing the edges of memories he usually avoids. The kind of memories that echo in long corridors or in the tight silence after a long day. But this morning, those echoes fade beneath the soft sound of a puppy learning how to trust the world again. After a while, Frost blinks awake, his small amber eyes searching the room. He tries to lift his head, wobbles, and leans into Dan's hand with a tiny sigh that feels like acceptance. Dan smiles gently and reaches for a folded towel warmed near the stove. He lifts Frost just enough to wrap the towel around his small body, keeping the jacket close for extra heat. "Let us get you cleaned up a bit," Dan says softly, using a corner of the towel to brush away the last traces of frost along the pup's ears. Frost leans into the warmth, tiny tail giving a faint, uncertain tap against Dan's palm. The gesture is small, but it carries the quiet courage of a creature deciding that life might be worth holding on to. Dan places Frost beside the warm water bowl again, steadying him with one hand. Frost drinks more this time, taking careful, slow sips. A small strength begins to show in the angle of his shoulders, the way he shifts his paws, the way he tries to stand even though he settles back down almost instantly. "You are trying," Dan murmurs, and the words feel heavier than a simple observation. They feel like something he once needed someone to say to him. The cabin fills with the subtle scent of heated cedar, the faint metallic hum of the stove, and the soft breaths of frost drifting in slow, even waves. Dan stands and moves to the counter, retrieving a can of mild puppy food he keeps for the occasional stray that wanders too close to the woods. When he brings it back and opens it, Frost lets out a tiny sound, a hopeful hum that lifts the corners of Dan's mouth. Dan places a small portion on a plate, warming it lightly near the stove, then sets it down. Frost hesitates, nose quivering, then takes a careful nibble. Another. And another. Dan watches, feeling something settle inside him that he has not felt in a long while. Not relief. Not certainty. Something quieter. Something like grace. As Frost eats, the snow continues falling outside, softening the world beyond the cabin walls. Inside, in the steady glow of the stove and the quiet heartbeat of morning, a Marine and a tiny German Shepherd puppy begin to share a fragile moment of peace that neither expected to find on a day that started with frost and silence. Morning settles into a quiet rhythm inside the cabin, the kind that feels almost sacred in its simplicity. The snow outside has softened into a gentle drift, brushing against the windows in slow, thoughtful patterns. Frost finishes his small meal and curls close to Dan's boot, his breathing steadying into a soft, rhythmic whisper. Dan watches him for a long moment, feeling the warmth of the stove spreading across the room like a quiet blessing. He reaches down and lifts the tiny pup again, wrapping him in the towel that still carries the faint scent of cedar and wool. Frost settles against Dan's chest, his small head tucked beneath Dan's chin as if the world makes more sense from that angle. Dan stands and walks toward the old armchair that faces the window. The chair has been here longer than he has lived in the cabin, the kind of furniture that seems to hold its own stories, softened by time and one too many winters. He lowers himself into it carefully, holding Frost with the gentle steadiness of someone who understands how fragile hope can feel in its earliest moments. Frost shifts once, then sighs, the kind of sound that melts slowly into the quiet of the room. Dan rests his hand along the pup's back, feeling the tiny heart beating beneath his fingertips. It is stronger now, more certain, like a drumbeat learning its own rhythm. Outside, the sky brightens, turning the snow into a wide sheet of pale gold. The creek beyond the ridge glimmers through the trees, its sound faint but steady, reminding Dan of the world continuing beyond these walls. He tilts his head slightly, listening. It has been a long time since such small things felt worth noticing. Frost stirs again and lifts his head just enough to look around the room. His eyes, once clouded by cold and exhaustion, now shine with a quiet curiosity. He looks at the window, then up at Dan, then nestles back into his chest as if choosing the warm heartbeat over the bright world outside. Dan chuckles under his breath, a soft sound that feels almost unfamiliar. "You have had a long morning," he murmurs. Frost answers with a tiny hum, barely a sound at all, but enough to make Dan's smile deepen. Hours pass like this, slow and warm. Dan checks Frost's paws, making sure they are no longer chilled, then massages them gently with a warm cloth. Frost watches him with wide eyes, trusting the process even when it feels new. After a while, the pup begins to show little bursts of energy, tiny kicks of his back legs, small attempts to sit up on Dan's lap. Each effort is brave, determined, and Dan notices the spark of spirit blooming in the small creature who nearly gave up on the frozen trail just hours earlier. The stove crackles softly, sending a faint glow across the room. Dan lifts Frost once more and sets him gently on a folded blanket near the fire. Frost curls into the fabric, but this time, he does not hide from the warmth. He welcomes it. The wind sweeps past the windows again, but the cabin holds its warmth, steady and unwavering. Dan watches Frost drift into sleep once more, feeling something inside him settle, something that had been restless for far too long. Peace does not arrive loudly. It arrives like this, in the soft rise and fall of a small chest, in the glow of a winter morning, in the presence of a life that now depends on him. And for the first time in a long while, Dan does not feel alone in the silence. Afternoon light spreads across the cabin in quiet, honey-colored waves as the storm finally loosens its grip on the ridge. Frost sleeps on the folded blanket near the stove, his tiny chest rising with a steadiness that did not exist when Dan first carried him through the cold. Each breath feels like a small affirmation, a whisper that the worst has passed, at least for now. Dan moves around the room with the soft tread of someone afraid to disturb a fragile peace. He checks the kettle, adds another log to the stove, and glances toward Frost every few seconds, unable to help himself. There is something grounding about watching a life return inch by inch, something humbling in realizing how close it had come to slipping away. A faint rustle breaks the silence. Frost stretches, paws reaching forward in a sleepy sprawl, and then lifts his head with slow determination. His ears, still soft and rounded at the tips, wobble slightly as he tries to find his balance. Dan kneels beside him, offering a steady hand. Frost leans into it, eyes warm and bright in the soft glow of the fire. "There you are," Dan says quietly, as if greeting an old friend rather than a pup he found only hours earlier. Frost takes a few steps, unsteady but purposeful, then turns back to Dan with a small sound that lands somewhere between a hum and a gentle plea. Dan picks him up, wrapping the warm towel around his body before settling into the armchair again. Frost curls instantly against his chest, the familiarity of that heartbeat bringing a sense of safety he cannot name. Outside the window, the snow lightens into a fine dust, drifting lazily across the trees. The world feels newly washed, softened, as if the storm that raged all morning has surrendered to something calmer. Dan watches it all with a quiet stillness, one hand gently tracing along the pup's back in slow, reassuring circles. Frost's breathing deepens, but he does not fall fully asleep this time. Instead, he watches the world from the cradle of Dan's arms, his eyes reflecting the soft glow of the stove. For the first time, he looks less like a survivor and more like a beginning. After a while, Dan rises and carries Frost to the small table near the window where the light collects in warm pools. He sets the pup down gently, then brings a fresh bowl of warm water and a tiny portion of food. Frost eats slowly but with more confidence than before, pausing only to look up at Dan as if checking that he is still there. Dan chuckles softly. "I am not going anywhere," he says, and Frost's tail taps the wooden surface in a faint, grateful rhythm. When the pup finishes, Dan lifts him again and returns to the armchair. Frost settles into the crook of his arm, eyelids drooping, but his breathing remains steady, strong, sure. The stove crackles. The wind quiets. The world narrows to a small circle of warmth and trust. And in that circle, Dan feels something shift inside him, something he has not felt in a long time. The cabin is no longer simply shelter from the cold. It is a place where hope has begun to breathe again, carried in the soft weight of a German shepherd puppy who chose to keep living. The last traces of the storm fade into a pale evening calm, the kind that settles gently over the Wyoming ridge like a blanket pulled across tired shoulders. Inside the cabin, the air glows with the soft amber of the stovetop flame, and Frost rests curled against Dan's arm, his small breaths warming the fabric of Dan's shirt. The pup has grown steadier with each passing hour, his heartbeat no longer fragile but sure, tapping against Dan's chest like a quiet reminder that life can return in its own time. Dan shifts slightly in the armchair, careful not to disturb the little body nestled against him. Frost blinks awake, lifting his head with a curious tilt, his ears wobbling in a soft, earnest attempt to listen to the world. The fire pops gently in the stove, sending a faint shimmer across the pup's fur. Frost gazes toward the sound, then back up at Dan with an expression that almost feels like a question. Dan smiles and rises slowly, holding Frost close as he moves toward the door. He opens it just enough to let the cold evening air drift in. The fresh scent of pine and snow rolls into the cabin, crisp and clean. Frost's nose twitches instantly, and he stretches slightly in Dan's arms as if greeting a memory he never had the chance to form. "It is all right," Dan murmurs, stepping onto the porch. The sky is a deep blue now, dusted with the first stars of the night. The snow along the ridge shines faintly, reflecting the last light of dusk. Dan stands still for a moment, letting Frost take in the world from the safety of his arms. The pup watches everything with wide eyes, the trees, the creek beyond the ridge, the slow drifting flakes that fall with grace rather than urgency. For a moment, it feels as though the entire forest is breathing with them. Frost lets out a small, soft sound, not distressed but thoughtful, almost reverent. Dan presses the pup closer to his chest. "This is home for now. You are safe here." The pup nestles into him, trusting that promise without hesitation. After a while, the cold edges of the air urge them back inside. Dan closes the door gently behind them, sealing the warmth in again. Frost's eyelids droop, heavy with the kind of tiredness that comes after a long day of surviving. Dan returns to the chair and settles down, placing Frost carefully on the blanket near the stove once more. The pup circles once, twice, then curls into a small crescent of fur and warmth. Dan watches him, seeing the subtle rise and fall of his breaths, the tiny flick of his tail as he drifts deeper into sleep. The cabin grows quiet, filled only with the rhythm of the stove and the faint whistle of wind against the eaves. Dan exhales slowly, feeling the tension he did not know he carried slip away. He reaches down and rests his hand on the blanket near Frost, not touching him, just close enough for the pup to sense the comfort. Frost shifts in his sleep, inching closer until his tiny paws rest softly against Dan's fingers. It is such a small gesture, but it carries the weight of a new bond being formed in silence. Outside, the stars brighten. Inside, the warmth deepens. And somewhere in the soft glow of evening, Dan realizes that the cabin no longer echoes the way it used to. A presence fills the space now, not loud or demanding, but gentle, like the first hint of dawn after a long night. Frost breathes on, steady and sure, as if he knows that he has finally found a place where his life can begin again. Frost sleeps deeply through most of the night, curled in a tight little circle on the blanket near the stove, his breath soft and even like small waves brushing a quiet shore. Dan remains awake longer than he expects, sitting in the armchair with the fading firelight flickering gently across his face. Something about the stillness feels different tonight, not empty but meaningful, as if the cabin itself has shifted to make room for the new, fragile life sleeping within its walls. When dawn finally pushes a thin silver line across the horizon, Dan rises quietly and walks toward the window. The snow has stopped, leaving the ridge wrapped in a pale glow that softens every edge. A soft sound behind him draws his attention, a tiny whine, almost questioning. Dan turns to see Frost lifting his head, stretching his paws toward the warm air as if greeting the morning. The pup looks stronger today, his eyes brighter, his movements more deliberate. Dan kneels beside him, brushing a warm hand along the puppy's back. Frost leans into the touch with an eagerness that was not there the day before, as though he has begun to trust the pattern of warmth and care that greets him now. "Good morning, buddy," Dan murmurs, and Frost's tiny tail gives a slow, hopeful wag. Dan prepares a small portion of warm food, letting the steam rise before placing it near the pup. Frost approaches it with more confidence than before, taking small bites with careful determination. Each bite feels like a quiet victory, a reminder of how far he has come since the frozen trail. When he finishes, Frost sits beside Dan's boot, looking up with an expression that is almost expectant. Dan chuckles softly. "You want to explore, do you?" He lifts the pup gently and wraps him in the familiar towel. With the morning light spreading across the floor in soft golden stripes, Dan steps out onto the porch. The cold air hits them immediately, crisp but far gentler than yesterday's storm. Frost lifts his head, nose twitching as he takes in the forest scent, the pine, the fresh snow, the distant murmur of the creek waking up. Dan holds him securely, giving him time to absorb the world at his own pace. The ridge glows under the rising sun, and Frost's eyes reflect the soft amber of the daylight. For a moment, he seems captivated, as if recognizing a world he never truly had the chance to see. After a few minutes, the cold begins to nip at the edges of the towel, and Dan brings Frost back inside. The warmth of the cabin greets them instantly. Dan places Frost again on the blanket, and the little pup circles once before settling down, paws tucked neatly beneath him. His eyes remain open, watching Dan with a calm trust that feels deeper today, as if a bond has rooted itself quietly in the night. Dan sits beside him on the floor, resting a hand near the puppy's tiny form. Frost inches closer until his side touches Dan's fingertips, a small gesture of connection that carries the weight of both gratitude and hope. Outside, the forest wakes slowly under the winter sun. Inside, in the soft glow of morning, a marine and a rescued puppy share a silence that no longer feels like emptiness but like the beginning of something gentle, steady, and meant to be. The morning brightens slowly, spreading soft bands of gold across the cabin floor as Frost begins to stir with a little more energy than before. His tiny paws stretch forward, his back arches in a slow, careful motion, and his eyes open with a brightness that was not present yesterday. Dan watches from the table where he has been sipping warm coffee, letting the steam rise in calm ribbons. He sets the mug down and crouches beside the pup, offering his hand. Frost leans into it instantly, pressing his small head into Dan's palm with a trust that blooms quietly, like a seed warmed by unexpected sunlight. "You are getting stronger," Dan murmurs, his voice soft and steady. Frost lets out a small sound, somewhere between a squeak and a sigh, and lifts himself onto unsteady legs. He takes a few steps across the blanket, testing each movement with gentle caution. His paws slip slightly on the wooden floor, but he recovers with a stubborn determination that makes Dan grin despite himself. The stove hums with a low warmth, the scent of cedar drifting lazily through the cabin. The world outside the window remains wrapped in winter stillness, an unbroken sheet of white stretching toward the distant ridge. Dan stands and retrieves the warm water bowl and a fresh portion of soft food, placing them near the stove. Frost approaches more eagerly this time, pausing only to glance at Dan as if asking for permission before taking his first bite. "Go on," Dan says, and the pup begins to eat with careful, grateful movements. Each small chew feels like another step back into life. When the meal is done, Frost pads toward Dan, nuzzling at his boot with a confidence that makes Dan's chest tighten in the gentlest way. "All right," Dan chuckles quietly, lifting the pup into his arms. "Let us see how the day looks." He carries Frost to the window, holding him just close enough for the pup to feel safe while still seeing the snowy world outside. Frost's ears perk, his nose twitching at the scent of cold pine wafting through the cracks of the old wooden frame. The sun catches in his amber eyes, lighting them with a soft glow. After a few minutes, Frost nestles back into Dan's chest, choosing warmth over curiosity for now. Dan steps away from the window and settles onto the rug near the stove. He places Frost gently beside him, and the pup circles once before curling against Dan's thigh. The small weight is comforting, grounding, a reminder that companionship sometimes arrives without warning. Dan runs his hand along Frost's back in slow, rhythmic strokes. The pup responds with a gentle hum, his eyes drifting closed as he soaks in the warmth and safety around him. The fire crackles softly. The trees outside sway in a subtle breeze. Time stretches into a peaceful stillness. As Frost settles deeper into sleep, Dan feels something quiet shift inside him, almost like the stubborn thaw of a long winter. It is not loud or dramatic. It is simply the steady, undeniable warmth of knowing that this tiny life, once fading on a frozen trail, has begun to trust the world again, and trust him most of all. The afternoon settles gently into the cabin, carrying a warm stillness that feels earned after days of cold and uncertainty. Frost sleeps beside Dan on the rug, his tiny body curled into a soft comma of fur, rising and falling with a rhythm that speaks of growing strength. The stove hums quietly, casting a golden shimmer across the room that dances along the wooden walls like small fragments of sunlight. Dan sits with his back against the armchair, long legs stretched toward the fire, one hand resting lightly near the pup. He is not touching Frost, but his fingertips are close enough that the pup can sense the presence. Frost shifts in his sleep, inching closer until his head rests against the side of Dan's boot. The simple trust in that gesture tightens something in Dan's chest in a way that feels gentle rather than painful, a warmth he has not felt in a long time. Outside the window, daylight softens into the pale blue of early evening. The ridge is quiet, the snow untouched except for a few windswept patterns that drift in long arcs across the hillside. The creek murmurs faintly in the distance, its voice carrying through the cold air like a reminder that life continues even in winter's grip. Frost begins to stir. His paws twitch, his ears give a small wobble, and he lifts his head with a sleepy blink. His eyes, once clouded by exhaustion, now shine with curious amber light. He rises on his unsteady legs, taking a few steps across the rug before turning back toward Dan with an expression that feels almost proud of himself. Dan smiles softly. "Look at you," he murmurs. Frost lets out a faint sound, a soft note of excitement as he wobbles closer, placing his tiny paws against Dan's shin. Dan scoops him up gently, mindful of the pup's small frame. Frost settles into his arms, tail giving a slow, happy sway. The warmth between them feels like a living thing, steady and sure. Dan stands and carries Frost to the window, holding him securely as the evening light settles on the snow. Frost gazes out, mesmerized by the soft glow spreading across the ridge. The world is quiet, unhurried, open in a way that seems to comfort the pup. After a few minutes, Frost nuzzles closer to Dan's chest, choosing warmth over wonder. Dan brushes a hand along the pup's back, feeling the soft fur warming beneath his palm. He steps away from the window and returns to the rug near the stove, lowering himself slowly and setting Frost down beside him. Frost circles once before curling into the crook of Dan's knee, resting his small head on Dan's leg with a contentment that feels like gratitude made simple. The fire crackles gently. The shadows stretch and soften. And in the quiet space between breaths, Dan senses the shift he has been approaching since the moment he found Frost on the frozen trail. It is subtle, almost shy, but unmistakable, a quiet renewal in his own heart, stirred awake by the fragile life now sleeping safely against him. The storm outside has passed, but something else has begun inside these walls, something warm and patient, something that feels very much like a new beginning. Evening gathers softly around the cabin, folding the ridge into hues of lavender and muted blue as the last of the daylight slips behind the trees. Inside, the fire has settled into a steady glow, its warmth pulsing gently through the wooden floorboards. Frost lies curled against Dan's leg, his breathing slow and even, his small body rising with a rhythm that feels stronger with each passing hour. Dan shifts slightly, careful not to disturb the pup, and watches the flames dance in the stove window. The quiet feels different tonight, no longer a hollow space, but something filled, something calm. Frost stirs, opening his eyes with a soft blink. He stretches his paws forward, pressing them against Dan's jeans as if asking for reassurance that the world is still warm, still safe. Dan lifts him gently, the tiny heartbeat pressing against his hand, and brings him closer to the fire's glow. The pup nestles into his chest with an ease that surprises Dan every time, as though trust is something he has known all along but only now remembers how to give. "You are doing well, little one," Dan murmurs. Frost tilts his head, ears wobbling, as though listening. Dan stands and walks toward the window, holding Frost securely so he can see the ridge under the night sky. Stars scatter across the darkness, clear and bright in the cold winter air. Frost's eyes widen, reflecting the faint glow, mesmerized by the world stretching softly beyond the glass. Dan feels the small body relax in his arms, as if understanding that beauty can be gentle. After a moment, he returns to the center of the room and sits on the rug. Frost takes a few wobbly steps across his lap, testing his legs again. Each step is steadier than the last, each pause followed by a determined little push forward. Dan watches with quiet pride, offering only a supportive hand rather than carrying him this time. "You just needed a chance," he whispers. Frost pauses at the edge of the rug, looking back at Dan, and then turns to explore a little further. He sniffs the base of the armchair, the corner of the blanket, the edge of the stove, tentative, curious, awake. The small discoveries seem to fill the room with a new kind of energy, gentle but alive. When he grows tired, Frost makes his way back to Dan, as if guided by instinct. He climbs clumsily into Dan's lap and settles down with a contented sigh. Dan wraps an arm around him, feeling the tiny heartbeat slow into calm assurance. Outside, the night deepens, the wind softens, and the stars settle in their quiet places. Inside, the warmth of the fire and the soft weight of Frost create a stillness that feels like healing. Dan closes his eyes for a moment, letting the peace settle into him, steady and unhurried. Frost shifts once more, nudging his nose against Dan's chest before drifting into sleep. And in that fragile touch, Dan feels something that has been absent from his life for far too long, a quiet faith returning, not through words, but through the small, steady trust of a puppy who chose to live. Morning settles gently over the ridge, a pale gold light spreading across the windowpane as if determined to ease the night's weight from the cabin walls. Frost wakes first, lifting his tiny head from Dan's lap with a soft, questioning sound. His ears wobble before standing a little taller, and his amber eyes catch the early sunlight with a glow that did not exist when Dan carried him in from the cold. Dan opens his eyes slowly, having drifted into a light doze on the rug sometime before dawn. The warmth of the fire has settled around them like a quiet shield, and Frost's small body remains curled partly against his chest, partly on the blanket. When the pup shifts, Dan smiles, rubbing a thumb gently along the soft fur between Frost's ears. "Good morning," he mutters, voice still heavy with sleep. Frost answers by nudging his nose against Dan's shirt, a tiny gesture that feels like the simplest form of gratitude. Dan rises carefully, lifting the pup with him. Frost nestles into the crook of his arm, not out of weakness now, but out of a growing habit, a trust that feels instinctive. As Dan moves toward the window, Frost lifts his head, alert to the quiet world outside. The snow glitters under the thin morning sun, untouched and shimmering like a clean slate. Dan stands there for a moment, holding Frost close as the pup takes in the scene with new brightness. The cold radiating through the windowpane reminds Dan of how fragile life felt just a day ago. He exhales softly, humbled by how much can change in a single night. Back near the stove, Dan sets Frost gently on the rug and prepares a warm portion of food. The steam drifts upward, carrying a scent that draws Frost forward with an eager little trot. His steps are not perfect, there is still a wobble in the way he places his paws, but there is purpose now, a spark of confidence growing where only survival lived before. Frost eats slowly, pausing every few bites to glance back at Dan as if checking that the world remains steady and safe. When he finishes, he wanders toward Dan and sits between his boots, looking up with an expression that carries something quiet and pure. Dan crouches, places a hand softly on the pup's back, and feels the steady rhythm of life beneath his palm. The fire crackles behind them, filling the cabin with a soft glow that feels more like dawn than the light outside. Frost takes a few more steps, exploring the room with sleepy curiosity, before returning to Dan, circling once, and curling against his foot. Dan sinks to the floor beside him, resting a hand near the small, warm body. Frost inches closer until his head rests on Dan's fingers, trusting the space, trusting the moment, trusting him. In the hush of the morning, with the snow shimmering outside and the fire steady inside, Dan feels an understanding settle into him, quiet, certain, gentle. Some bonds are not formed by words or time. Some are formed by the simple act of refusing to give up on another soul. Frost breathes softly, safe and warm, and Dan lets the truth of that settle into his heart like a morning prayer. The ridge holds its breath as the day unfolds, the kind of quiet morning that seems to understand it has witnessed something fragile and worth protecting. Frost lies curled against Dan's palm, his tiny body warm and steady, his breath soft but sure. The fire in the stove crackles in a slow, peaceful rhythm, casting gentle shapes across the floorboards. Dan watches the puppy sleep, feeling the weight of the moment settle into him with a calm that runs deep. The cabin is still, but not empty. The silence has shape now, softened by the presence of a small life that refused to surrender. When Frost stirs, it is with a tiny stretch, his paws unfurling like petals touched by sunlight. He blinks up at Dan, ears wobbling before settling into a hopeful tilt. Dan smiles, something warm moving across his face in a way he has not felt in years. "You are stronger today," he whispers. Frost answers by climbing clumsily onto Dan's leg, nestling into the fabric as if settling into a story that finally belongs to him. Dan lifts him gently, holding him close as he walks toward the window. The snow glows under the pale morning light, untouched except for the faint traces of yesterday's wind. Frost gazes out, his nose twitching at the cold scent seeping through the edges of the glass. Dan feels the puppy's heartbeat against his chest, steady and true. "You made it," he says quietly, not out of disbelief but gratitude. Frost presses his head under Dan's chin, accepting the warmth offered without hesitation. Dan returns to the rug near the fire and sits down with the pup in his lap. Frost shifts, looking up at him with clear amber eyes, eyes that no longer hold fear but something gentler, something like recognition. Dan places a hand on the puppy's back, tracing a slow line along his spine, feeling the life beneath his palm. Frost sighs softly and rests his head on Dan's leg. The world outside remains cold and wide, but inside, something small and faithful has taken root. The fire hums, the trees sway lightly beyond the walls, and Frost's breathing settles into a peace that feels almost sacred. Dan realizes, with a rare stillness, that the miracle was not loud. It was not sudden. It was quiet, born on a frozen trail, carried in his jacket, fed by hope, and held alive by two beating hearts leaning toward each other in the cold. He closes his eyes for a moment, letting the warmth settle around them. Frost shifts again, nudging his nose against Dan's hand before curling into a comfortable crescent of fur. The gesture is simple, but it carries weight, the kind of trust that cannot be taught, only given. The stove crackles once more, a soft, reassuring sound. Sunlight edges across the floor, brushing the pup's fur with a golden sheen. Dan breathes deeply, feeling the truth settle quietly inside him, the kind of truth that does not need to be spoken aloud to be real. Sometimes faith does not arrive with certainty. Sometimes it arrives in small breaths, warm fur, and a heartbeat that keeps choosing to stay. Frost sleeps on, safe and sound, a reminder that even in the coldest places, life can find its way back to the light.